Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a tiny rural village called Mvezo, situated along the banks of the Mbashi River in South Africa. His family belonged to the Thembu royal house, and although he was born into a lineage of chiefs, his early life was far from privileged. His father, Gadla Henry Mafakanyiswa, was a local chief who served as a counselor to the Thembu king. His mother, Nonkafi Nosekeni, was a deeply spiritual woman who raised her children with strong values of honesty, humility, and kindness. In his family's language, his birth name Rolihlahla meant pulling the branch of a tree, or more loosely, the troublemaker. No one at the time could have guessed how prophetic that name would become, for Mandela would grow into the man who shook the very roots of South Africa's oppressive system. Mandela's childhood was deeply rooted in African traditions. He grew up running barefoot through the fields, herding cattle and listening to the elders recount tales of bravery and struggle by the fire at night. His mother instilled in him the importance of respect, faith, and patience. Though life was simple, it carried within it the seeds of leadership. Even as a boy, Mandela's presence commanded attention. There was a quiet seriousness in his eyes that set him apart. When he was 7 years old, his mother sent him to a local Methodist school. On his very first day, following colonial custom, the teacher gave him a new name, Nelson. This was a common practice at the time, as African children were often stripped of their indigenous names in schools run by Europeans. From then on, Rolihlahla became Nelson, though in his heart he always carried both names. Education opened new worlds for Mandela. After primary school, he went on to study at Clarkbury, and then at Healdtown, institutions run by missionaries where discipline and hard work were emphasized. It was at these schools that Mandela began to realize the power of knowledge and the value of leadership. In 1939, Mandela enrolled at Fort Hare University, one of the few higher education institutions open to Black Africans. Fort Hare was prestigious, producing many of Africa's future leaders. Here Mandela met lifelong friends, including Oliver Tambo, who would later become his comrade in the struggle against apartheid. Fort Hare exposed Mandela to politics in a deeper way. He witnessed student activism, debates about justice, and discussions about Africa's future. Mandela himself became politically active when he joined the Student Council. When the university tried to impose rules that students considered unjust, Mandela and his peers organized a boycott. For his defiance, Mandela was expelled from the university. Though he lost his place at Fort Hare, he gained something greater: the courage to resist authority when it was unjust. After leaving Fort Hare, Mandela found himself drawn to Johannesburg, the bustling city that was the heart of South Africa's economy. It was a city of sharp contrasts, immense wealth on one side and grinding poverty on the other. Here, the reality of racial segregation struck Mandela forcefully. Africans lived in crowded townships forced into menial jobs, while whites enjoyed privilege and power. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked a series of jobs, first as a mine guard and then as a clerk, while continuing his law studies. It was in the city that he met Walter Sisulu, a man who would change the course of his life. Sisulu was already connected to the African National Congress, the ANC, an organization committed to fighting for the rights of Black South Africans. Through Sisulu, Mandela was introduced to a network of activists and thinkers who opened his eyes to the scale of injustice in his country. Mandela completed his law studies and, alongside his old friend Oliver Tambo, established South Africa's first Black-owned law firm. Their small office in Johannesburg became a place of refuge for countless poor families who had no defense against the cruel machinery of apartheid law. Mandela often represented clients for free, arguing passionately for their rights in court. The firm became more than a practice. It became a symbol of hope. By this time, apartheid had been officially institutionalized. In 1948, the white minority government passed laws that enforced racial segregation in every aspect of life. Black and white South Africans were forced into separate schools, hospitals, buses, neighborhoods, even separate benches in public parks. Basic rights were stripped away. A black man could not walk freely in his own country without a pass. For Mandela, it was impossible to stay silent. Within the ANC, he rose as a dynamic leader, organizing protests, marches, and campaigns. In 1952, he played a leading role in the Defiance campaign. a mass movement where thousands of ordinary people deliberately broke apartheid laws to expose their injustice. Mandela traveled across the country, delivering fiery speeches and encouraging people to stand together. For his role, he was arrested for the very first time. Prison bars closed around him, but his spirit was not broken. If anything, it made him stronger. In 1955, the ANC and its allies drafted the Freedom Charter, a visionary document that declared, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." It called for democracy, equality, and human rights. To the white minority government, this was nothing short of rebellion. The following year, Mandela and 156 other leaders were arrested and charged with treason. The trial lasted for years, draining the energy of the movement but also making Mandela a national figure. By 1961, all charges were dropped, and Mandela walked free, his reputation as a courageous leader firmly established. Up until this point, Mandela had followed the philosophy of nonviolence, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. But in 1960, everything changed. At a peaceful protest in Sharpeville, police opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 69 men, women, and children. The massacre shocked the world and broke Mandela's faith in peaceful protest alone. He came to believe that armed resistance was the only remaining option. That year, he helped to establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela went underground, disguising himself, moving from safe house to safe house, and secretly training young men in the tactics of sabotage. The plan was not to kill, but to strike at symbols of apartheid: government offices, power plants, railways. But in 1962, Mandela was captured. The government accused him of leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to prison. 2 years later, during the Rivonia trial, Mandela and his comrades were charged with plotting to overthrow the state. The trial gripped the world. On the day of his sentencing, Mandela stood in the dock and delivered words that would live forever. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Those words struck like thunder. Instead of death, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was taken to Robben Island, a windswept prison fortress surrounded by icy seas. There, in a tiny cell barely large enough to stretch his legs, Mandela began what would be 27 years of incarceration. By day, he was forced to break rocks in a limestone quarry. By night, he returned to his narrow cot, cut off from the outside world. Newspapers were banned. Letters from his family were rare, censored, and often delayed. His mother passed away. His son was killed in a car accident. Mandela was denied the chance to attend their funerals. Yet even in the harshest conditions, Mandela's resolve never broke. He studied relentlessly, teaching himself and educating his fellow prisoners. Robben Island became, in his words, a university of the struggle. Mandela transformed suffering into strength. This was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would one day carry him from the darkness of his cell to the presidency of his nation and into the hearts of people around the world. Nelson Mandela entered prison as a young man full of energy, and he would leave nearly 3 decades later with white hair, but with a spirit stronger than steel. Robben Island was meant to crush him, to reduce him to a number, to break his body and his will. But instead, it became the place where Mandela truly became the leader who would change the course of history. On the island, Mandela's cell was barely 6 feet by 9. He slept on a thin mat on the floor with only a small blanket for warmth against the cold winds of the Cape. Every day, he and the other prisoners were forced to do hard labor in the blazing sun, chipping away at stone in a lime quarry until their hands bled. Guards tried to strip them of dignity, making them wear shorts instead of trousers, feeding them smaller rations than white prisoners, and restricting visits and letters to a cruel minimum. Mandela lost his mother while in prison. Later, his eldest son died in a car accident. The authorities denied him permission to attend their funerals. These personal tragedies cut deep, but Mandela refused to let grief or bitterness consume him. Instead, he transformed his pain into strength. Over the years, he turned Robben Island into what he called a university. He read voraciously, studied law and politics, and taught younger inmates about leadership, history, and resistance. He debated with fellow prisoners, listened to their concerns, and inspired them to see beyond their own suffering. Even some of the prison guards came to respect him. Slowly, Mandela became more than a prisoner. He became a symbol. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. The apartheid system grew harsher, but so did resistance. In the townships, uprisings flared. Around the globe, people began to chant the same demand: free Nelson Mandela. His name was painted on walls, sung in protest songs, shouted in the streets of London, New York, Lagos, and Delhi. To millions, Mandela became the face of the struggle for freedom, even though he could not speak to them himself. As the years passed, international pressure on South Africa intensified. Countries imposed sanctions. Sports teams and artists boycotted South Africa. The economy weakened and the government found itself increasingly isolated. By the 1980s, the apartheid regime realized it could not maintain its grip forever. In prison, Mandela too was aware that the fight was entering a new phase. Secretly, the government began to approach him with offers of conditional release. If he renounced violence, they said, he could walk free. But Mandela refused. He declared that only when the people were free would he accept his own freedom. Finally, after 27 long years behind bars, the moment came. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. As he walked out of Victor Verster prison, hand in hand with his wife Winnie, the world held its breath. The image of his raised fist, his smile broad and unbroken, traveled instantly across the globe. For South Africans, it was like seeing the sunrise after a long night of darkness. But freedom brought new challenges. Mandela emerged into a country still deeply divided. Violence simmered in the townships, political groups clashed, and extremists on both sides resisted compromise. Yet Mandela's message was not revenge. He called instead for reconciliation. He urged Black South Africans not to hate their white countrymen, and he reached out to the very leaders who had once kept him in chains. "We must forget the past and build a new nation together," he said. The early 1990s were a turbulent time. Negotiations for a new South Africa were often on the verge of collapse. Violence threatened to derail the talks. But Mandela's calm authority, his patience, and his vision held the process together. Slowly, painfully, apartheid's walls crumbled. In 1994, history was made. For the first time, South Africans of all races stood in the same lines under the same sun to cast their votes. The world watched in awe as a nation that had been torn apart for centuries took its first steps toward unity. When the results were announced, Nelson Mandela had been elected as the first Black president of South Africa. His inauguration on May 10, 1994, was a scene the world would never forget. Leaders from across the globe gathered in Pretoria to witness the moment. Mandela stood on the steps of the Union buildings wearing a simple suit, his face shining with dignity. He looked out over a sea of people, black, white, young, old, and declared that never again would South Africa be ruled by oppression. As president, Mandela faced enormous challenges. The economy was fragile, poverty and inequality were widespread, and the wounds of apartheid were still raw. But Mandela chose the path of healing. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where victims of apartheid could tell their stories and perpetrators could confess their crimes. It was a bold experiment in justice, one that balanced accountability with forgiveness. Mandela also understood the power of symbols. In 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup, a sport long seen as a symbol of white pride. Mandela did something extraordinary. He put on the green jersey of the Springboks, the national team, and walked onto the field to cheer them on. When South Africa won the tournament, Black and white South Africans celebrated together for the first time in living memory. That moment did more to unite the country than speeches or policies ever could. Mandela's presidency was marked not by luxury but by humility. He lived simply, often visiting his home village, sitting with ordinary people, and reminding everyone that leadership meant service, not power. He refused to cling to office. After serving just one term, he stepped down in 1999, setting an example for the entire continent and the world. Even in retirement, Mandela's work continued. He campaigned for HIV/AIDS awareness, urging South Africans to confront the epidemic openly. He mediated in conflicts across Africa. He spoke out for peace, justice, and human dignity wherever he went. His presence alone carried weight. Kings, presidents, and ordinary people alike bowed to the moral authority of a man who had endured 27 years in prison without bitterness. In 1993, Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, shared with F.W. de Klerk, the last apartheid president, for their efforts to bring democracy to South Africa. But the true prize, Mandela often said, was the freedom of his people. Mandela's later years were marked by global admiration. He was affectionately called Madiba, his clan name, a title that carried deep respect. Children sang his name, leaders quoted his words, and nations sought his guidance. He became more than a politician. He became a symbol of forgiveness, of perseverance, of hope. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The world mourned. Millions wept, not only in South Africa but in every corner of the globe. Yet his death did not mark an end, but a continuation of his legacy. His life had become a light, a reminder that even the longest night can be followed by dawn, that even the deepest hatred can be healed by forgiveness. Mandela once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but it's inspiring others to move beyond it." And that is exactly what he did. From a small village in the Transkei, to a prison cell on Robben Island, to the presidency of a nation, Mandela showed the world what true courage, sacrifice, and humanity look like. His story is not just South Africa's story. It is the story of humankind's struggle for freedom. It is the story of a man who lived not for himself, but for the ideals of justice, equality, and dignity for all. And long after his passing, Nelson Mandela remains alive, in the dreams of those who still fight for a better world, in the voices of those who refuse to accept injustice, and in the hearts of those who believe, as he did, that one person can indeed change the world.